Okay, so we've already set up the simulation here for our little torch effect. Now it's time to make it look like a torch effect using shaders and XSI. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll select the point cloud here, and if you open up the render tree by hitting 7, you'll notice that what we have here is not exactly the right shader we want to use for a torch effect. So let's close that. What we'll do is we'll switch over to the modeling menu set by hitting 1 on the keyboard. Make sure that this ignition point cloud is selected. Go to the material menu, and then down here we'll go to ice particle volume. Click on that, and that'll place a volume shader on the ice particle effect. Let's close that PPG. Now let's go ahead and hit 7 again to open up the render tree here, and this is what we have. Let's take this material and let's rename it. So select the material and hit F2 on the keyboard to rename it. Let's call it ignition torch. Makes more sense and keeps things organized. Now, automatically what we have here is a particle shaper node and a particle renderer node. Both of these are compounds, and these are the easy way of setting shaders up in XSI 7. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to elect to use the more complex way to set up the shaders. So I'll disconnect that, and what I'm going to do is just take these two shaders and hit delete on the keyboard to get rid of them. You notice the ignition torch is no longer rendering, and if we do try to render this particle effect, you'll notice that nothing renders out. That's because there's no nodes or shaders connected to the material node here. So let's go ahead and fix that. Let's open up the preset manager, and under the particles category, what we want to do is get ourselves a particle volume node. So let's drag and drop that into our render tree. We also want to go ahead and grab ourselves a particle density node to define the density and the shape of our particles. So let's take this node and let's plug it into the volume input of the material node. It's pretty much the only place where you can connect this. And if I were to render this out, I'm just going to get this big old block of particles or whatever that is. Doesn't even look like particles. To fix that, what we'll do is we'll take this particle density node, take its density output, plug it into the volume here, and what we want to do is plug it into the density port right there. So once we do that, it goes density to density. And now if I render this out, you notice now we start to get some particles. Of course, this doesn't look too great. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to fix that. We're also going to need a couple of other nodes here. We're going to have to go back into the preset manager and then go to the particle gradient node here. And let's drag and drop that in there. Close that. And we're going to need a couple of these particle gradient nodes. So I'm going to take this one that's right here, hit Control C to copy it, and then Control V to paste it. And now we have two of them. Alright, let's make another connection here. You notice the particle density node has this color output right here. We want to take that and plug that into the particle volume cloud node. And where we want to plug that into is the diffuse color. So you'll see right here, diffuse color. Plug that right in there. And now this one's going to control the color of this node right here, which is exactly what we want. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's render this out again. And you notice that now it's starting to come out a little bit yellowish right there, and so on and so forth. What we want to do is take this first particle gradient that we created right here, and we're going to plug it into the particle density node here. So let's take it. Let's plug it in, and now it's asking us which port we'd like to connect this to. Well, we want to connect it under the per cloud or gradient. We want to connect it down in the color node right here, the color input. So plug it in there. Now you notice that it turns blue, or sort of a purplish color. Now if we render that out, this is what we have. Still doesn't look too great. You also notice there's these little grainy effects right here happening in our particles. So we could start to adjust the color, or we could start to adjust the quality. Let's go ahead and start to adjust the quality of the particle volume cloud shader right here. So we'll double click it to open up its PPG, and we have ourselves quite a large number of different tabs and different parameters here. So we're going to have to go and change these to fix up the quality. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to go over here to the global density in the first density tab, and we're going to go ahead and increase this to about 400 to make this a little bit denser. It'll be a little bit hard to notice the effect. If I switch this back to 100, you'll notice that the particles are less dense. So I want this to be up to 400. so the particles have more density to them and they're thicker. That's what I want. Okay, now with that done, let's move over to the color tab. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the intensity of the diffuse color to 0.75. So it's not by much, but it does make a bit of a difference if you look closely. And I'm going to take the ambience intensity, knock it all the way down to 0. I don't want it to have that ambient intensity washing out the effect. I'm going to leave the rest of these parameters alone. Let's move over to the shading tab over here. Now the shading tab is really important. The reason is because down here we have this restrict illumination lights parameter, and if we turn that on, we can now select which lights we want to affect the particle cloud. Essentially, we can tell the particle cloud to not be affected by any lights in the scene except for the ones that reside inside of this list. Now right now we don't have any lights set up for this, but we are going to be setting up lights for this real soon. So I just wanted to point that out to you. I'll go ahead and I'll leave that on, and I'll just move along here, and when we create the light we'll come back to this and get that parameter squared away. If I go over here to the marching tab, I can set the detail level to low, default, or high. If I set it to default, you notice the quality automatically increases and gets better. So I'll leave it at default for now, just so I get a better look at this and I can tweak this a little bit better. If I go over to lookup table, I can change the cell interpolation. I can also change the cell size. The smaller the cell size, the better quality your particles are going to be. The larger the cell size, for example, if I increase it to say 1.5, you're going to notice now that the quality drops and the cells are missing some of the particles, which is not a good thing. So if you want the particles to render out real nice, you have to lower it to something like, say, in this case, 0.1, because these particles are so small. Now you notice that there's more detail in the particles and they look a lot better now because the cell lookup table is smaller and catches the particles more correctly. Alright, so now that that's done, we're going to move over to the preview tab here. And in the preview tab, we can turn on preview mode just so it renders out faster. But I like to keep it off just because it's still rendering pretty fast on my machine. And at the same time, I get a better look at the final quality instead of looking at a preview mode that's got degraded quality. Frame buffer we're not going to worry about. We're not going to worry about final gathering either because we're not using any final gathering. And shadows, we're really not going to go ahead and change anything there. So now that I'm done with the particle volume cloud PPG over here, I'll close it. And now it's time to go into the particle density PPG and start to change some of these parameters around. So I'll just collapse this particle gradient that's down here just so that we can focus on the particle density PPG. Alright, so in the first tab, the texture tab, there's a few parameters that I want to change. The density texture up here, I'm going to go ahead and leave it alone. The default settings are fine. But the shape area over here, I'm going to make one little change. I'm going to change the intensity from 0.66, the default, to 0.75. We can see the difference update there in the viewport. We don't really see much of a difference there. So let's keep tweaking some of these settings. The intensity density, I'm going to increase it all the way to 1. And I'm also going to go ahead and change the density limit low for smoke down here. 10 is way too high, so I'm going to drop it to something like 0.5. Okay, so now we can see that the effect looks a little bit better. It's looking more like how I want it to look. Okay, so we're getting there. We're getting there. Let's go over to the next tab. So in texture coordinates, I don't want to change anything there. I don't want any shape and rotation. Miscellaneous is fine, and we're not dealing with strands, so we don't have to change anything here either. So let's go ahead and close this and start to adjust the actual colors of this particle effect. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the particle gradient node right here. And we can see we have a ton of parameters to tweak. And we also have this RGBA gradient that we can change the colors to make this look the way that we want. Alright, I only want to have 2 colors on this gradient. By default, you can see we have 6, which is not what I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all of these very quickly and easily simply by clicking on one of these presets down here. I'm going to select black/white. So it gives me only two color swatches, which obviously isn't going to look too great because now it's gray. a grayscale effect, which is not what we want. So let's go ahead and make some changes here. I'll select the first color swatch and come in here and change these colors around. So let me switch to HSV, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take my hue, and let me also increase my value here, and let me just max out my value. Let me also take my saturation here, and I'll place my saturation at about 0.6 will be pretty good. And I'm going to take my hue and place that at about 0.5. We'll see something that looks nice and bluish, sort of like a cyan. I think 0.5 is gonna 0.54 is gonna work out just fine. Okay. Now in terms of the value, this has to be pretty blown out because we need this torch effect to be pretty bright. But we'll come back to that in a moment. We'll select the second color over here, which happens to be white, and we'll have to change that one as well. So let's go ahead and adjust some of these parameters. I'm going to go ahead and the value I'm going to leave white here is pretty good. And I'm going to take the saturation and increase that. And let's take the hue, and what we want is this sort of bluish purplish color. So I'm going to take the hue to about 0.6. And the saturation here, I want to increase that to something like 0.8 just to make this nice and saturated. Make it very, very blue. Okay, so now we have that blue effect. Unfortunately, right now, the effect doesn't look very bright like the way that a torch would probably look. So we have to go ahead and make some changes here. What I'm going to do is take the value here, and I'm going to increase it. If you notice, the highest I can go to is 1. But if I go into the actual numerical field here, I can actually increase that and overdrive it. So let's overdrive it to say a value of 3, and that's going to make it really bright. As you can see here in the render region, it's looking pretty bright. Okay, pretty good, pretty good. So we're getting there. Let's select the first color swatch and do the same thing to this one. And I want to increase this value here. Let's try something really high, like say 6. And that looks pretty bright, right? Okay, so I'm going to leave it at 6 for the moment. And I need to make some more changes here. I want to take this little, if you notice this little dot in between, this little marker changes the position of the gradient. What I want to do is lower this position pretty low. Okay, so now that I got the little gradient position there, I can isolate the little bluish effect over here on the right and keep the rest of it this sort of purplish blue color. Let me go back here, and I don't think I want to make any changes for this at the moment, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave it alone. Alright, so looking good, looking good. Let's make a few more changes. Let's adjust the gradient position parameters over here under the gradient tab. Now we can see that the per cloud density has its own set of parameters, and over here the per particle age percentage also has its own set of parameters. What I want to do is I want to increase the intensity and influence of the per particle age percentage all the way to 1. And you notice there's a very subtle change in my render region. The next thing I want to do is work with the per cloud density parameter up here. The default of a start at 5 and an end at 0 isn't really going to do me very good. So let's start to lower the gradient start. And I want to lower it by a lot. So I'll just lower that. And I also want to go ahead and increase the gradient end. So I'll increase it by a little bit. I think that much might be pretty good. Okay, so it's a very subtle effect. Let me increase this one a little bit more. So let me get close to about 0.7 and see what we've got. And I'll increase this one here. And if you hold down shift while you do this, you can increase in small increments, because it's a little bit hard to change the numbers by small amounts when you just use the mouse. But hold down shift while you drag with the mouse to control that a lot better. And I'm also going to take the intensity and influence. I'm going to drop that to about 0.6. See what that gives us here in the render region. Okay, getting better. Alright, now the next thing I want to do is control the density. So let me go ahead and close this. We can see I created this other particle gradient over here. Well, it's time to plug this into the particle density shader. So I'm going to take it, plug it in, and I'm going to plug it into the density port that's just below the color port here where we plugged in earlier. Okay, there we go. Now let's open up this particle gradient here to go ahead and control the density. All right, let's switch over to the RGBA gradient tab over here. And again, we have way too many colors here. So I'll click on black and white again to get rid of that. And the first color swatch, I'm going to change it to pure white. Close it. And what I want to do is I want to affect the alpha. You'll notice down here we have this A parameter, which is the alpha. Right now it's completely opaque. What we want to do is make it transparent. Let's make it completely transparent so it's see-through. And you notice how it starts to affect the render region here. Now the effect starts to look a lot better. So let's go ahead and use this gradient to control the density of the actual shader effect. Okay, so the next thing is to bring this color swatch closer over here. Okay, and what we want to do is keep it white, but let's affect the alpha. You can see in the render region the effect that was created. It pretty much got rid of the neat effect that we had earlier, but that doesn't matter. We'll go ahead and change that. Let's drop this to about 0.09. Looks pretty good. And the alpha, let's go ahead and increase this alpha. I'm going to get it to about 0.1 is going to work out pretty good. Right there is pretty good. I'm going to keep it at about that range, 1.3 and 1.4. I'm sorry, 0.14, 0.13. About right there is pretty good. And now what I'll do is I'll just click over here on the gradient to create a new color swatch, and I'll put this one all the way at the end. I'm going to take it and let me just change the color to black. All right, and for the alpha, let's take the alpha and let's put it all the way to 0. So basically this color back here is transparent. Okay, all right, so that's pretty much going to go ahead and do it for us. Now let's go to the gradient position here. And let's make some changes over here to the gradient position. The gradient starts at up here in density parameter. I'm going to knock that all the way down to 0. I'm also going to increase its intensity and influence to 1. And I'm going to take the gradient ends at, and I'm going to increase that to about 1.5, 1.6 will work pretty good. So we see we get this very interesting effect with this sort of rim lighting right here on the sides, which looks really cool. Okay, now down here in the gradient starts at for the age percentage, let me go ahead and increase this by just a little bit. Something close to 0.1 will work out just fine. So let me just increase that very slowly. Let me see what that gives me. Pretty nice. I like that. It's very subtle effects and changes, but they do make a big difference in the end result. Let me take the intensity and influence and increase that to 1. Okay, so we end up with this. Now it looks a little bit dim and it looks dark, and we're going to fix that a couple of ways. Let's close this PPG since we don't need it anymore, and let's go back to the first particle gradient, the one that's controlling the actual color. Let's go to the colors over here. I want to go to the first color swatch. Now if I switch over here to HSV, you'll notice that the value is set to 6. Let's increase that to 10 just to get this nice and bright. So it'll make it brighter. Okay. Now the next thing we need to do is add a light to this to make this look right. So let's go ahead and let's do that. I'll close this render tree view here. Let me close that render region. I'm going to go back to the first frame of the animation, and let's go ahead and let's go to primitive, and let's go to light, and I'm going to go ahead and create myself a point light. Okay, I'm just going to roughly move this into position about right here. All right, this video has been running for a pretty long time, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pause it right here and stop it, and I'll start up a new video and we'll continue exactly where I left off here.